Hey, how about that sign? This was a gift from my unbelievably thoughtful niece. Not gonna cry. A few months ago, when I was getting the winter tires mounted, some dildo chipped up the factory wheels on the Boogie Daily. And after learning that hard lesson, the only person I'm taking my precious wheels and tires to is Jason at Forever Customs. If you need to find him, you can catch him on Instagram for any of your wheel refinishing needs, or if you just need some tires for your daily, hit up Tire Consultants over in Reading. That's a 2017 Mark 7 GTI, and I think it's the best daily in the world. Only problem was, it was a little nerdy, so I figured, while I was in there, I might as well get some summer tires mounted on some summer wheels, and while I was in there, coilovers. I decided to go with a whole set of Bilstein B16 coilovers. And I actually started making a video about all that, but it turned into a shit show. The car needed brakes. No big deal. Pads and rotors. How hard could it be? Well, after slapping on the pads and rotors, the rear passenger side kept locking up every time I would apply the brakes, and it was dragging super hard. Now, I wasn't sure if it was a caliper sticking or a collapsed brake hose, which can happen. I ordered a pair of rear calipers and new brake hoses so I could get it done in one shot and just be over it. After jerking around with it for more than a week, the car's back on the road, and let's just say it was either the hoses or the calipers, and not worry about who did what wrong. Now today I'm getting back on the Boogie Van. That's my 2017 BMW wagon. A BMW? Really? What is this, bougie chassis? Now if you're confused why some YouTube dildo would go and ruin a nice car like a BMW by bagging it, let me explain. Now I was looking for an easy project, something I could slap together, and I figured a late model car would make it easy. Minimum fabrication, but something that had air conditioning, cruise control, something I'd take on longer drives, and something I could put a big ass thumping stereo in. Now speaking of the air suspension, this Bavarian boat is already kind of a battleship. So bagging this thing is really only going to ruin it just enough. Now the Boogie Van's already sitting on its air suspension. I had two issues to get over. One, I wanted to order custom wheels for the car, and I needed the suspension in so I could get measurements for those wheels. And two, back to the issues I had with my daily. Since the car was stuck on jack stands, I had to slap this air suspension together, tie in all the bags on ball valves, and drive the thing for over a week back and forth to work. Thankfully for me, the car actually rode and drove gorgeous, and the air suspension held. And as a side note, it actually drove better than it did on the stock suspension. Fucking Germans. Now if you can't get with that, this channel and this project might not be for you.
Bitches leave.
Now here we have the air system for the Boogie Van. It's an Airlift 3H. It has ride height sensors at all four corners and an ECU that's integrated into the valve block. This valve block monitors the height sensors at each corner and adjusts on the fly to maintain a predetermined ride height. Now I chose a height-based setup so I could throw a couple friends, if I had friends, into the back of the car, and my presets should, keep the predetermined ride height under any changing condition. Now I've expressed my distrust over these ECU controlled air manifolds in the past, so I'm going to trust the process and take one of my brave pills. Happy Tales Animal Hospital, Chuck, Terrier, Yorkshire. Wow, the colors. So all I gotta do is fill all that crap in a station wagon. No problem.
You can't fit all that in here. You're shit out of luck there. You fucked over here. No room over there. You fucked over here. This a dumb idea. You can't fit all that in here. You shit out of luck there. You fucked over here. This a dumb idea.
Now this hateful fucking thing is an exhaust tubing cutter made by Schwaben. Schwaben? It allows you to cut your exhaust nice and straight. Years ago when I was just a wee little shit, I was at a cruise night with my Uncle Gary. A really nice street rod went by, and my Uncle Gary just shook his head. When I asked him what his issue was, he said, "Too quiet. A custom should talk to you when it goes by." So with that in mind, I decided the Boogie Van needed a little bit of character. Now I was all prepared to build my own setup, till I did a little bit of looking online and found out that ECS Tuning make a muffler delete specifically for this car. It's pretty cheap too, and has decent instructions. Now if I measured right, this baby should just slip right on and use the factory hangers. Quality looks pretty good. We'll see how she fits. And no, the Boogie Van will not get some bullshit crackle tune, because we're adults around here. Now that I have all this room up underneath the car since the muffler's gone, that's a perfect place to put this 5-gallon aluminum tank I got from Airlift. So like I said, I'm going to put my compressors up underneath here. When I saw how close the new exhaust was going to be to the compressors, I drove the Boogie Van around, let it idle, just to torture test it a bit. When I checked the temperature, it was only about 80 degrees. So good Lord willing, the heat from the exhaust won't affect the compressors. Found a handy spot to mount the compressors on the rear bumper bar. Since it's steel, I can weld to it. So I cleaned up a few places and welded in an 1/8" plate. Now fast forward a few days and I got a few things done. I got the plate for the compressors fully welded onto the bumper bar. I got it fully coated in POR 15 and I drilled and tapped the mounting holes for the compressors. Ooh. So here's the outcome for now. Both heads on the compressors are actually pointed down slightly at an angle. The part where the compressors come the closest to the exhaust is over here by the exhaust tip. I'm not too worried about that because the exhaust tip has got to be one of the coolest parts of the entire exhaust. Still have the opportunity to do some heat shielding. We'll see if that's even necessary. The eagle-eyed among you might notice
Biatch.
I took the leader hoses off of the compressors. My plan is to put water traps right off the end of the compressors. That way I can reach up under the bumper and drain the water traps from time to time. You really don't want to run any plastic DOT line right off the compressors. The air coming out of the compressors is very hot and it will melt the plastic line. We'll get into my solution for that in a little while. Let's just say if you've been around the channel for a while, you won't be surprised by what I'm going to do. For now, this is a wrap. Fast forward a bit, it's the day after the Maryland Mayhem car show. Shout out to Maryland Mayhem and Patrick Brooks for putting on a good show. Since I got hated on by that muffler delete, I gotta drop back and punt, come up with another spot to put this 5-gallon aluminum air tank. I reluctantly decided to mount the air tank in the hatch. Since the tank fits behind the seat, I whipped up a quick enclosure to mount the tank, make it a little bit more presentable. This solution also gives me a good spot to eventually mount the sub amp, which is convenient. Now my buddy Old School Mike was by a couple weeks ago. We got to talking about where I was going to mount this valve block. And I found this little cubby hole back behind the driver's rear wheel. There's a removable compartment so it'd be super easy to get to. Then Mike said, why don't you just mount the valve block in the box with the air tank? Ever since then I've been fighting with myself trying to decide between the wheel well and the air tank box to mount this stupid valve block. My only issue with mounting that valve block in this air tank box is the fact that there's going to be a spaghetti mess of lines back there. So the time for thinking is over, it's time for violence. I stripped the hatch area to access the spot I have in mind for the airlift manifold. Whipped up a quick bracket for the opening behind the driver's wheel well. Punched some new holes in a car I've only owned for a few months. Perfect. Whammed in some 1/4-20 riv nuts. Perfect. Filled it with the cheapest shit hardware I had laying around. Then blasticated it down with the impact to round off the fasteners. After a quick test fit, I welded a shelf to the bracket to bolt the manifold on. Realized I couldn't see what I was doing and grabbed my glasses. Enough of that shit. It's time to run airlines. And you know what? What? I'm glad you asked. There are two convenient body plugs right here and here I can use to pass the lines and all the wiring through. Now the only catch, the factory amplifier is right in the way of those holes. And then there's this little module over here. Tell you what, let me move that for you. This is the back side of those plugs. Now all I got to do is find a way to relocate the factory amplifier and whatever the other box is. So I made this piece of plate. It drops down. It drops down. It locks in. Come on, bitch. It drops down. Locks in place just like the factory amp rack does. The factory amp rack is held down by these Frankenstein bolts on 3 corners and a stud over in this corner. It has to go on and slide back. I also cut holes in the plate so that all the tubing and wiring can pass through. Now this is the factory amplifier and bracket that I'm moving out of the way. You got this big John here, which I believe is the amplifier. And this little doodad on the end has 2 ears on either end. I can get a 1/4-20 bolt through them, no problem. That's easy. This bigger amplifier has these V grooves cut into it. And it slides down into those V grooves and is held captive by a bolt at the top. That's a little bit harder to make. But I made this piece of plate. I marked out these angles to match the factory plate and then guessed on their width. Luckily I hit it right on the head. Now I notched right here because I wasn't sure how far that unit was going to sit down. So I've actually got to get a support there to put that top bolt through. And with that unpleasantness behind us, it's time to dress up the holes where the airlines are going to pass through. And you want to know how I'm going to run the airlines through the holes without them chafing? Ow! With a grommet. This grommet's from Seals It. I used it before in the Boogie shop truck. I really like these because I can actually bolt them on. So I'm going to use those factory plugs, drill a couple holes, set some rib nuts, and call this thing done. So here we have the new amp rack. Got it all painted up, test fitted a few things. It's ready for assembly. I was able to save this little spring clip at the top that came off the factory amp rack, so I got that going for me. So the big amp just goes through the opening, comes down, tabs grab into the slots that I cut on the backside. We put this shitty little factory screw back in, and viola. And this little doodad just goes in with a couple of 1/4-20s. By the way, I kept all the patterns I used to make the brackets you're seeing in this video. If there's enough interest, I might do a run on these parts. Let me know down in the comments. I've got the compressors plumbed up too. I have water traps right on the compressor heads, which gives me a couple of advantages. It keeps the water traps as low as possible in the air system, making them more effective. It also protects the rest of the system after the water traps. And one thing I am going to have to watch, I installed some better check valves than what come with the Vire compressors after the water traps. It would be more ideal to have the check valve inboard of the water trap, but this configuration fits the space I have better. We'll see how that works. Then there are 90-degree JIC fittings going to aluminum fuel line and bulkheads through the floor of the car up to the air tank. I plumbed the valve block up with some 45-degree push-to-connect fittings in order to miss the relocated factory amps on their way through the grommets to the outside of the car. And ran all the wiring for the height sensors through the other grommet. All the wiring and airlines dumped behind the passenger side rear bumper, where BMW made a handy box to keep them safe. From there, the lines and wiring are routed between the subframe and the body. As far as electrics go, got an 8-gauge running from the battery over to a breaker. And before I get too crazy here, it's time for a public service announcement, because there's something I think people just aren't getting. When it comes to sizing your breakers, fuses, and your wiring, this is how it is, bar none. First, you start with your load. In this case, it's the compressors for the Boogie Van. Now, a pair of Vire 444 compressors draws 40 amps. Now I've established the load that's in the system. From there you go into your wire size. I've got 8-gauge wire feeding the compressors. The ampacity of the wiring is what determines your overcurrent protection. So whether it's a fuse or a breaker, you need 40 amps of protection. And an 8-gauge running from the breaker over to the relay on the driver's side of the car to run the compressors. This little fuse holder powers the Airlift manifold. Where I fucked up is I could have used this power distribution block right here. At the time I didn't really know what it was. Rev 1 of this whole install, I'm going to tie everything in here, should make it a lot cleaner. Now right here you find the relay. After giving Airlift all my hard-earned money, I realized the system's only meant to run one compressor. And if you want to run a second compressor, you have to buy a second harness with a second relay. Since I'm smarter than they are, I'm running a shit Amazon relay. Coincidentally, this is the same one that's on the Boogie shop truck, which has never failed me. The only catch here is that the Airlift uses ground to trigger. When I wired this relay, I ran positive power to it, added a disconnect switch up in the center console, and just plugged the Airlift lead directly into the relay. So now when the manifold calls for the compressors to come on, it completes the ground circuit, Bob's your uncle, compressors are running. And don't get me started on the ride height sensor mounting. Suffice to say, they're done. Now I'm ready to fire up the air system for the first time. Now there's a whole startup procedure you have to go through, so let's go ahead and begin that. Ooh, actually, since the compressors are going to run, let's go ahead and start the car. What in the skibbity bullshit is this? So, it would appear the Boogie Van is being a little too BMW-ish right now. I picked up a scanner and found 118 fault codes coming out of this raft of crap. After clearing the codes, swapping in a new battery, praying to sweet baby Jesus, it's still no better. So this is starting to become a bad habit. Took the car over to Forest Hill Auto in Red Lion, which is owned by Brian Forest Hill, I don't know. Brian just happens to be a master BMW mechanic. It ended up just being a low pressure fuel pump fuse holder. Brian was able to bend the contacts back in, and the Boogie Van was instantly barking fire again. After reassembling the hatch, I cut a slot in the package tray cover for the airlines to run through. Later on, I'll have to cut a big slot out of this cover because there's a nice storage bin below and I want to have access to it. Then, just slip the box over the top of the airlines, drop the rear seats down, connect everything up from the front of the air tank box. In the hatch by the tailgate there's a hinged cover. I ran the air tank drain line back here and added a nipple to it. That way I can fill the tank from an air compressor if I ever need to. Should I do wheels? I like wheels. I'm gonna do wheels. So, I fucked around so long, my custom made wheels showed up. I was gonna save them for another video, but now if you're a random BMW boy, or Mrs. Boogie, you're probably thinking, how ugly. But if you're a person of class and style, you'll recognize a set of Boyd's Tri-Fans when you see them. I realized I needed a set of pretty weak spec wheels in order to tuck the rear of this car. My set are 19x8 plus 40 offset. Add to that the fact that this German U-boat is all-wheel drive, I had to go with the same size all the way around in order to keep the drivetrain from tearing itself apart. Now these Boyds are directional, meaning that there's a right and a left set of wheels for the car. There's been a lot of debate over the years about which direction these wheels should face, but I'm going to put that whole discussion to bed right now. See this center cap? If the wheels were on the opposite side of the car, the center cap would read backwards. Now in preparation for this German long roof, I've been learning the metric system. I put a couple miles on these wheels and tires, so it's time to retorque them. I just got to look up the torque spec real quick. What the fuck is a Newton meter? What is that in real numbers? So how'd we do? You know, to be honest, I don't know. I'm just fucking with you. It's amazing. It is so nice. Modifying late model cars like a cheat code. All the fun without most of the heartache and major repairs. This car looks good. As always, Jason from Forever Customs knocked it out of the park. Mounted the wheels up without any damage and they look amazing. This car sounds good. All without any major compromise. There are some caveats though. While calibrating the Airlift, I ran into a few issues. I haven't been able to get the ride height sensors to calibrate. I'm not sure why. So for right now, I'm just running on the pressure presets. Having said that, even the pressure presets gave me a little bit of trouble. Luckily for me, Airlift has a pretty good customer service. I made a few calls asking some questions, and it probably comes down to the 3/8 airlines that I chose to run. Essentially the issue is those 3/8 airlines provide a lot of flow between the tank and the manifold, and the Airlift is a little bit dumb-witted. So when it sees all that flow and it tries to open the valves just a little bit to get just a little adjustment, it freaks out, can't handle it, and just fails the calibration. The tech I talked to suggested putting a throttle valve between the tank and the air manifold to slow it down a little bit. That worked out pretty well. Now my lift speeds are a little bit slower, which isn't such a bad thing. Now that worked out so well, I might add another throttle valve to the dump line also. Now I'll eventually get all this stuff dialed in, but for the meantime running on the pressure presets is working out really well for me. I've got a lot more in store for the Boogie Van here, as well as the Boogie shop truck. So keep an eye out for those videos coming soon. And thanks for watching.